It was sometime in the final days of October when I found myself moving through the outskirts of Albuquerque, approaching the city from the north just as the sun was beginning to dip beneath the horizon, casting long streaks of orange and red over the open desert landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The kind of light that gives the impression the sky might be burning just beneath the clouds. It made everything feel distant and slightly unreal, as though I were traveling through a place suspended outside of time. I had been driving for hours that day, with no particular urgency or clear destination in mind, moving from one small, forgettable town to the next, pulled not by necessity, but by a kind of quiet, persistent need to keep going, to stay in motion rather than settle. The city itself emerged without ceremony. A scattered collection of industrial parks and aging strip malls, rising from the flat plain as though stitched hastily onto the land. I wasn't looking for anything more than a place to sleep. Just a bed, a door that locked, and a few hours of solitude before the next stretch of road. The motel I chose was exactly the kind of place you imagine when you think of a long-forgotten highway turnoff. A 2-story concrete building with rooms facing the parking lot, paint that had long since faded to a patchy beige, and a neon sign out front with several letters burned out, casting a flickering, half-formed glow that barely cut through the deepening twilight. The office was a cramped glass enclosure that smelled faintly of stale air conditioning and heavily perfumed disinfectant, with a counter scuffed from years of use and a disinterested man seated behind a small monitor who barely looked up as I gave him my ID and credit card. I received the key card with the kind of silent transaction that suggested neither of us expected anything memorable to take place that night. The room I had been assigned was on the ground floor at the far end of the corridor, near the corner where the walkway turned sharply and disappeared out of view. And I remember passing a dented soda machine that emitted a low, mechanical groan, its faded display flashing nonsensical numbers that pulsed without rhythm. Inside, the room was exactly as I'd expected it to be. Neither clean nor especially dirty, just worn in the way places become when they are used too often by people who never plan to stay long. The bed was firm to the point of stiffness, the blanket patterned with a geometric design that tried and failed to hide a few darker, irregular stains. And the air carried a lingering scent of chemical cleaners clinging faintly to something older and more difficult to name. Something buried in the fibers of the carpet and upholstery, impossible to fully erase. Overhead, the single ceiling light buzzed softly as it flickered to life when I entered, casting a pale, uneven glow that made the corners of the room feel dimmer than they should have been. At first, I barely noticed the sound. It was subtle, something just beneath the threshold of conscious thought, like the low drone of a distant power line or the murmur of an old appliance cycling through its function. But once I settled in and turned off the television, closed my bag and began preparing to sleep, the noise became unmistakable. It wasn't coming from any one place, and that was what unsettled me first. I flipped the switch to kill the overhead light, and though the bulb dimmed and went dark with a soft pop, the buzzing didn't cease. It remained exactly as it had been before, steady and unbroken, not the kind of sound that fluctuates with power usage or faulty wiring, but something flat and persistent, as though it had no origin at all. I assumed it must have been one of the devices in the room, so I began unplugging them one by one, starting with the television, followed by the microwave, the lamp on the desk, and even the small alarm clock that blinked an artificial red from the bedside table. I crouched behind the mini fridge, pulling its cord from the wall and listening carefully each time the power cut, waiting for the noise to shift or fade. But nothing changed. The buzzing was still there, constant, low, and disturbingly unaffected by anything I did, as though it were somehow part of the room itself rather than a byproduct of the machinery within it. It was not loud, not something that would startle or command attention. But the longer it lingered, the more it seemed to nestle into my thoughts, slowly eroding the silence in a way that made everything feel just slightly wrong. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was simply a leftover noise from the city outside, or a vibration coming from a nearby room. But the walls were still, and the air was too flat for sound to carry so cleanly. After lying in bed for what must have been 20 minutes, turning from side to side in the half-darkness with my eyes fixed on the ceiling, I finally sat up. The sensation of being watched forming not as a sudden jolt, but as a slow, creeping tension that began in my chest and climbed to my throat. Kneeling on the carpeted floor, I lifted the edge of the bed skirt and angled the light from my phone underneath, expecting to find nothing more than a lost hanger or a wad of lint. But almost immediately, my flashlight caught something rigid and black, attached with a strip of dark tape to the metal support beam that ran across the bottom of the frame. At first, I thought it might have been part of the bed structure, some outdated wiring or maybe an old patch from a previous repair. But as I looked closer, I could see that it was not only separate from the frame, but intentionally placed. It was a small rectangular object, unmarked and matte, slightly smaller than a deck of cards, with a fine mesh grid etched across one side that reminded me instantly of the surface of a microphone. There were no blinking lights, no wires leading away from it, no branding or identification that would suggest who had placed it there or for what purpose. And the fact that it was so neatly affixed, taped without slack, positioned carefully beneath where a person's torso would naturally rest, made something in my stomach tighten with a pressure that felt like nausea, but settled deeper, more like dread. This was not something forgotten or misplaced. It was deliberate. It had been waiting. I didn't touch it. I didn't photograph it or call anyone. Instead, I stood slowly, moved backward from the bed, and stared at the space around me as if seeing it properly for the first time, realizing with a clarity I hadn't possessed earlier that I had been occupying a room that wasn't entirely mine, one in which the illusion of privacy had quietly dissolved. The noise, the subtle, ceaseless buzz, no longer sounded mechanical to me. It felt like an acknowledgement, a sign that something had been monitoring, recording, storing whatever it was able to capture from the moments I'd spent unaware. I didn't bother folding anything. I just grabbed what I had, shoved everything back into my duffel without organizing it, zipped it up hard, and slung it over my shoulder like I was trying not to give myself time to think. There was no dramatic panic, no scramble, just a cold, clear instinct that told me I had seen enough, and that staying even a minute longer meant pushing my luck. I didn't plan on stopping at the front office, but I found myself heading that way anyway, walking under those buzzing lights, past the row of doors that all looked the same. Maybe part of me thought that saying something would make it feel less strange, like I'd wake up from it if someone just gave me a normal explanation. I stepped inside, waited in front of the glass, and told the man what I'd found under the bed. He didn't look up at first, just nodded once like I'd asked about a towel or the Wi-Fi. He said he'd tell maintenance, his tone flat and automatic. There was no follow-up question, no offer to check the room, no sign that what I was saying had caught him off guard in the slightest. I remember thinking how practiced it felt, like this wasn't the first time someone had said something similar. And for the briefest second, When he finally looked at me, I thought I saw something shift in his expression. Not surprise, not concern, just a quiet sort of recognition. Like I had confirmed something he already knew, but didn't feel like acknowledging. I didn't push it. I turned around and left without another word, letting the door swing shut behind me as I crossed the lot. The wind had picked up a little, carrying with it the smell of dry concrete and dust from somewhere beyond the highway. I got in my car, started the engine, and didn't even glance back toward the office window. I just pulled out and drove, watching the motel shrink in the rear view until it disappeared behind a low rise in the road. I stayed on the highway longer than I meant to, passing exits without checking the signs, just letting the tires hum beneath me and the night air drift in through the cracked window. I didn't have a destination, just the need to put distance between myself and that room. The buzzing was gone. I knew that. But every time the road went quiet, I caught myself listening for it anyway. Not because I expected to hear it again, but because part of me wasn't sure it had really stopped. I don't talk about it much. Most people wouldn't know what to make of it. But every now and then, when I check into a new motel, when I slide the key card into the door and step into a room that smells like cleaning spray and dust, I find myself looking under the bed, behind the dresser, anywhere something small might be hidden. I don't always find anything, but I still look. I arrived in Reno late on a cold and quiet evening in mid-November of 2021, near the end of a long, exhausting stretch of business travel that had kept me on the road far longer than I had intended. And by the time I turned off the highway and merged onto the quieter local roads, the lights of the city felt distant and unfocused, as though I were passing through the outermost edge of something barely awake. The sky was overcast, and the air carried the sharp, dry scent of asphalt and frost. And as I approached the hotel I had booked a few days earlier, I found myself hoping for nothing more than a clean bed, a working heater, and a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. The hotel, one of those mid-tier chain establishments positioned conveniently close to freeway exits and gas stations, was neither impressive nor memorable in appearance. Its beige stucco exterior, dim parking lot lighting, and tired landscaping conveyed the same familiar sense of uniformity I had come to associate with 1,000 anonymous overnights in cities I barely remembered afterward. I parked my rental car near the side entrance, grabbed my suitcase from the back seat with a hand that felt heavier than it should have, and made my way into the building without seeing a single other person. Inside, the lobby was quiet in the way that only late-night hotels can be. Silent, still, and subtly oppressive. Where the low hum of vending machines and the dull glow of fluorescent fixtures become the only proof that time is still passing. I stepped up to the check-in counter, where a young man, whose posture and demeanor suggested that he had already mentally detached himself from the remainder of his overnight shift, took my name with a brief nod, typed a few commands into the computer without looking directly at me, and then handed me a plastic keycard sleeve bearing the number 312 written in black marker with the casual shorthand of someone who no longer questioned whether the details mattered. I made my way toward the elevator, pulling my suitcase behind me across the patterned carpet that muffled my footsteps and made the entire experience feel strangely distant from the ordinary rhythm of life. The elevator sought to arrive slowly, its doors parting with a reluctant shudder, and as I stepped inside and pressed the button for the third floor, I noticed that the air inside the cab smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something else I couldn't place. Something metallic, perhaps, or simply stale from disuse. The ride up was uneventful, though each passing floor added to the growing stillness that pressed in from every side, until the bell chimed softly and the doors opened onto a hallway that looked identical to every other I had walked down in places like this. The third floor was dimly lit, and the carpeting stretched down a narrow corridor lined with muted beige walls and identical dark brown doors, each marked with a small plaque indicating its number in gold lettering. I didn't see or hear anyone else on that floor. Not a single door ajar. No sounds of voices or televisions. No footsteps or passing carts from housekeeping staff. Just the faint buzzing of overhead fixtures and the distant hum of the building's HVAC system, both of which seemed to emphasize the emptiness rather than disturb it. As I moved down the hallway toward my room, which was located near the end in a recessed corner where the corridor turned slightly toward the emergency stairwell, I remember feeling an inexplicable unease that I attributed, at the time, to simple fatigue. When I reached the door marked 312, I pulled the key card from its sleeve, slid it into the lock, and waited for the green light and soft click that indicated the door had released. The moment I pushed the door open and stepped inside, something felt wrong. Not dramatically or immediately alarming, but in the quiet, creeping way that causes the body to tense before the mind has fully caught up. The room was not dark as I'd expected it to be. Instead, the bedside lamp closest to the window had been left on, casting a soft amber light across the neatly made bed, the narrow writing desk, and the blank television screen on the wall opposite. At first, I assumed that housekeeping had simply left the light on as a courtesy for late arriving guests, which some hotels occasionally do, although this was not something I'd come to expect from properties of this kind. However, that mild curiosity was immediately eclipsed by the realization that I was not alone in the room. Seated on the edge of the bed, facing slightly away from me toward the far wall, was a man who appeared to be in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in what looked like business casual attire, pressed slacks, a tucked-in shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to the forearms, and a pair of dark shoes positioned side by side on the floor just beneath his knees. He sat with his back mostly straight, his hands resting flat atop his thighs, and his posture so completely motionless that for a moment I questioned whether he might be sleeping upright or in some kind of trance. He made no effort to turn and look at me, offered no greeting or explanation for his presence, and displayed no reaction whatsoever to the fact that someone had just entered the room. There were no bags beside him, no coat draped over the chair, no items placed on the dresser or the bathroom counter. Nothing that would indicate that this man had arrived with belongings or intended to remain for any length of time. The room itself, aside from his presence, was pristine in the impersonal and undisturbed way that hotel rooms tend to be before a guest has made any mark upon them. The sheets remained crisply folded, the towels tightly rolled in the bathroom alcove, and not so much as a pillow out of place. Everything about the scene felt eerily frozen, as though I'd entered a photograph rather than a real room. Although I did not say anything aloud and did not take another step forward, I remained standing in the doorway for several seconds, my hand still resting lightly on the handle of my suitcase. And during that time, a deep and irrational sense of discomfort began to grow in me. Something that went beyond confusion or annoyance and settled instead into the unmistakable sensation of trespassing. It was not just that I had walked into a room occupied by someone else, but that I had interrupted something I could not identify and had no wish to understand more fully. The atmosphere felt charged in a way that defied explanation, like the air was too still or the silence too thick. Without speaking, without flicking on any lights or calling out to the man seated on the bed. I quietly stepped backward into the hallway and let the door ease closed in front of me. Once outside, I stood in place for a few moments, breathing slowly, as though I had just walked away from something precarious and was waiting to see if it would follow. There was no sound from the room behind the door. No movement, no creaking floorboards, no change in the muted light that leaked through the narrow gap beneath it. Eventually, I made my way back down to the lobby, trying to collect my thoughts into something coherent before approaching the front desk. I explained, as calmly and clearly as I could, that there had been someone already inside the room I'd just unlocked. A man, older, seated at the edge of the bed, who hadn't acknowledged me or moved or said a word. The clerk, a young man in his 20s wearing the hotel's navy uniform and a headset, looked up from his monitor with a furrowed brow, not alarmed exactly, but visibly uncertain, like he couldn't decide whether to take me seriously or offer some routine assurance. Still, to his credit, he began checking the reservation system without challenging what I'd said. After a few minutes of quiet typing and checking various tabs, he told me that the room had been marked vacant since early that afternoon. It had already been cleaned, inspected, and listed as ready for a new guest, me. There was no note in the system indicating that maintenance had been called, no pending guest requests, and no sign that anyone else had been checked into that room at any point that day. According to the hotel's digital records, it should have been completely empty. After a brief pause, he offered to walk back up with me to take another look and make sure everything was in order. I hesitated for a second, more out of an instinctive unease than any real objection, but eventually nodded, and together we took the elevator back to the 3rd floor. The hallway was just as I'd left it. Quiet, sterile, humming faintly with the low sounds of HVAC and overhead fluorescence. When we reached the door, the clerk used his master key to unlock it, and I stood just behind him as the door swung open. The room looked exactly the same, but this time it was empty. The lamp was still on, casting that same warm yellow light over the made bed and beige walls. But there was no one sitting at the edge of the mattress now. No figure in the chair, no personal belongings, no disarray. The sheets were still tucked with hospital precision, the carpet was undisturbed, and there was nothing out of place. The man I'd seen, whoever he was, whatever he had been doing there, was simply gone, without a trace. The clerk didn't say anything. He just stood there for a moment, glancing around the room, and then quietly offered to move me to a different floor. I accepted without asking any further questions. I didn't want to press the issue, and truthfully, I'm not sure I would have known what to ask even if I had. That night, in the new room they gave me, I barely slept. Every ordinary sound, the faint creak of the vents, the click of the thermostat, the soft shifting noises of the building settling, took on a strange weight. I found myself lying in bed for hours, listening for anything out of place, watching the dim outlines of the furniture and wondering whether I'd feel it again. That sensation of stepping into a space where something wasn't quite right, where something had already been. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like a quiet tension that wouldn't let go. I checked out early the next morning, well before the sun came up. The woman at the front desk greeted me with the same neutral friendliness I've come to expect from hotel staff. She handed me my receipt without comment, and there was no mention of the room change, no alert in the system, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred the night before. As far as the hotel was concerned, everything had gone exactly as planned. Since then, I've stayed in a lot of different hotels, business trips, vacations, weekend getaways, and nothing like that has happened again. But the memory lingers more than I expected it to. Not because I'm afraid exactly, but because I can't explain it in any way that makes sense. I've tried rationalizing it. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe I'd walked into the wrong room at first. Maybe there was some kind of brief mix-up that resolved itself before the system caught up. But none of that fits cleanly with what I saw. And even now, I'm not sure I'll ever fully let it go. These days, I always pause for a moment before opening any hotel room door. Just a second or two, long enough to listen, to feel the air, to sense whether something's off. It's not a fear I carry with me exactly, more like a quiet instinct, a habit I picked up that night. Because part of me still believes that it could happen again, that I could unlock another door someday and find someone already there, not reacting, not belonging, just sitting in silence under a lamp that shouldn't be on, as if I'd stepped into a room that had been waiting for someone, but not for me. In the autumn of 2018, during a period in my life when the days had begun to feel repetitive and muted, I booked a quiet weekend in Savannah, Georgia. Drawn by the allure of cobbled streets, drooping Spanish moss, and the kind of soft, humid stillness that seems to cling to old cities like an echo of the past, refusing to be forgotten. Wanting to avoid the anonymity of modern hotels, I selected a boutique guest house in the historic district, a building that, according to its description, had once served as a private residence in the late 19th century, and now operated as a small, carefully curated inn with only a handful of rooms, each restored to reflect the aesthetic of its original era. When I arrived on a Friday afternoon, the weather had turned slightly overcast, and the streets, though not empty, had that subdued quiet that often settles over tourist districts in the off-season. The hotel itself stood 3 stories tall with ivy clinging to one side and wrought iron balconies, curling like old script above shuttered windows. Inside, the reception area was dimly lit and filled with the scent of beeswax and cedar, with wooden floorboards that creaked beneath my steps, and a desk that looked as though it had been pulled directly from a law office circa 1890. The woman who handed me the brass room key had a professional demeanor, but offered little beyond the essentials, as though she were either distracted or simply uninterested in conversation. And her eyes flicked briefly toward the staircase behind me, with a hint of something unreadable, before she returned to her paperwork. My room was situated at the far end of the 3rd floor, just beyond a long hallway lined with sconces that offered more ambiance than actual illumination. And when I opened the door and stepped inside, I was immediately struck by how carefully the room had been styled to retain its old-world charm. The walls were covered in floral-patterned wallpaper that bore faint watermarks beneath the windows. The ceiling was high and trimmed with aged crown molding, and the floor was uneven in places, creaking slightly beneath the weight of my steps, as though the boards themselves remembered every guest who had ever passed through. Dominating the space was a large brass bed frame with a velvet quilt neatly folded across its foot, and across from it stood a tall, built-in wardrobe with paneled doors that reached nearly to the ceiling, the wood darkened by time and polished just enough to catch the light from the solitary table lamp in the corner. Despite its elegance, or perhaps because of the way its charm seemed so carefully maintained, there was something about the room that felt slightly off from the moment I entered. An almost imperceptible wrongness that I couldn't quite explain, as if the air in the room hadn't been disturbed in a very long time, or as if the furniture, despite its immaculate arrangement, had been hurriedly returned to place after some quiet disruption. The temperature never seemed to stabilize, remaining stubbornly cool in one particular corner near the wardrobe even after I adjusted the old radiator knob. And at one point, I thought I felt a faint current of air brushing across my ankles. Too subtle to be from the window and too focused to be a draft from the hallway. The first night passed without anything I could definitively label as unusual. Though I awoke several times without understanding why, feeling disoriented in the unfamiliar bed and convinced, in that strange pre-dawn logic, that I had heard something. A door clicking shut, the soft scuff of footsteps across wooden floorboards that stopped the moment I opened my eyes. Each time, I listened for several long minutes, staring into the dim corners of the room until my heartbeat slowed again. And though I eventually fell back asleep, I carried a faint sense of disquiet into the following day. It was not until the second night that the atmosphere in the room shifted from subtly strange to something more active, more deliberate. I had been lying in bed with the lamp on low, and my book resting unread on my chest when I heard the first sound. An irregular dragging scrape that seemed to come not from the hallway outside or the room next door, but from within the wall itself, specifically from the area just behind the built-in wardrobe. The sound came again, followed by a short pause and then a dull, muted thud, as though something solid had been moved slowly and then released. Sitting upright, I strained to determine the direction, my ears adjusting to the stillness that followed. But the noise had ceased as quickly as it began, leaving me unsure whether I had imagined it entirely or whether something or someone had moved within the space I had assumed was nothing more than solid architecture. The rest of the night passed in anxious half-sleep, broken by moments of unease, during which I thought I heard soft tapping or the faint rasp of movement just out of sight. But each time I turned toward the sound, there was nothing to see, only the dark outline of the wardrobe standing motionless against the far wall. By morning, daylight had restored some of my confidence, and after dressing and preparing a cup of weak in-room coffee, I crossed the room and opened the wardrobe doors, which groaned faintly on their old hinges. The interior seemed unremarkable at first. 2 short rails for hanging clothes, a shallow top shelf holding a folded blanket wrapped in paper, and a polished floor that matched the rest of the room. But when I tapped lightly on the back panel, the sound that returned was unmistakably hollow, resonant in a way that suggested empty space behind it. I leaned in closer, pressing my palm against the wood, and noticed a barely visible seam along the right edge of the panel. So subtle, it blended almost perfectly into the grain. And when I crouched to examine the bottom, I saw a pair of rusted hinges so small and flush to the floor that I might have missed them entirely had I not been looking for something out of place. After a moment's hesitation, I slid my fingers beneath the edge and pulled gently. The panel moved with unexpected ease, swinging inward to reveal a narrow crawl space, no more than 3 feet high and 5 feet deep, cloaked in darkness that seemed to drink in the light. The air that drifted out was stale and bitter, laced with dust, mildew, and the unmistakable scent of human presence that had lingered too long in a place not meant for habitation. I lifted my phone and used its flashlight to illuminate the space, revealing a low, cramped compartment with bare wooden walls, uneven floorboards, and the unmistakable signs of recent activity. There were discarded food wrappers scattered in one corner, a crumpled water bottle pressed flat against the wall, a small pile of peanut shells strewn near what appeared to be a makeshift sleeping nest fashioned from a stained blanket and a few torn pieces of fabric. The dust had been disturbed, the floor marked with streaks that suggested someone had crawled through the space repeatedly and recently, not years ago as one might expect, in a forgotten corner of a historic building. The air felt suffocating, too still, and the longer I stared into that space, the more certain I became that whoever had been inside had not simply passed through. It had been occupied, used, lived in. I backed away slowly, taking care not to disturb anything, and closed the panel as quietly as I could, pressing it back into place until the seam nearly disappeared once again into the wood grain. I then moved one of the heavier chairs across the room and placed it in front of the wardrobe, more as a psychological barrier than any real protection. But it helped, if only slightly, to reduce the sense that something, or someone, might return to that space from behind the wall. Later that evening, after sitting for nearly an hour trying to convince myself that what I had seen could be explained by poor maintenance or forgotten renovations, I made my way downstairs, expecting that once I shared what I had discovered, the hotel staff would react with concern, perhaps even a hint of urgency or alarm. Instead, what I received was an unsettling lack of emotion, a hollow kind of politeness that felt rehearsed. The woman behind the front desk, someone I hadn't seen before, older than the young man who had checked me in, with a professionally stiff posture and a pinched look around the eyes, listened without once interrupting as I carefully explained what I'd found behind the wardrobe. The loose panel, the narrow crawl space cloaked in darkness, the used blanket, the food wrappers, and the unmistakable feeling that someone had been in that space not long ago. Her expression remained passive, her eyes unfocused, almost as if she were waiting for me to finish a story she had heard before. When I was done, she didn't ask follow-up questions, didn't take down any notes, or even feign interest in inspecting the room. Instead, in a tone devoid of surprise or genuine concern, she offered to move me to another room on a higher floor, claiming the one I had originally been assigned to was so rarely booked and occasionally used for storage. She said it as though that explanation should settle the matter. And I remember thinking that her words felt practiced, like she'd said them before and would likely say them again. I accepted the room change, not because I felt safer or believed I would get any real answers, but because I couldn't bring myself to lie down again, just a few feet from that hollow space, knowing it had harbored someone who might still have access to it. The knowledge clung to me, made the shadows seem heavier, and I had no interest in testing whether or not the panel would stay shut through the night. Weeks later, long after I'd checked out and returned to my routine, the memory of that crawl space still clung to me in a way I couldn't shake. Not entirely out of fear, but because it felt like I had stumbled into something that I wasn't meant to know existed. My curiosity got the better of me, and I began searching through Savannah's historical preservation records, which were surprisingly detailed thanks to the city's strict conservation codes. The hotel, being a registered historic property, had publicly accessible building plans filed in the municipal archives. I found floor-by-floor schematics, each carefully drawn to scale and annotated with dates of renovations and ownership transfers. But when I reached the third floor, the floor I had stayed on, something caught me off guard. The plans were clear and thorough, down to closet dimensions and wall thicknesses. But nowhere in the architectural drawings was there any indication of a cavity or recess behind the north-facing guest room walls. According to the original structure and all subsequent modifications on file, the space I had entered should not have existed. That part of the building, on paper at least, was meant to be solid wall. No crawl space, no access panels, nothing at all. To this day, I can't offer a satisfying explanation for what that space was originally intended for, how it had remained undocumented, or why the hotel staff seemed almost resigned, rather than surprised when I reported it. What I do know, with absolute certainty, is that someone had been living in that recess recently enough to leave behind evidence that hadn't yet gathered dust, and that the presence of that person, whoever they were, had been quietly tolerated, if not entirely ignored, by the very people meant to ensure the safety of their guests. Ever since that weekend in Savannah, something in the way I perceive unfamiliar rooms has changed. Whenever I stay in an older hotel, especially those that boast antique charm or advertise themselves as quaint or rich in history, I find myself inspecting the architecture more closely than before. I run my fingers along the seams of wood paneling, push against built-ins to check for give, and sometimes just stand silently in the center of the room, listening. Not just for noise, but for a kind of tension in the air. The kind that suggests a space is holding its breath. Because once you've discovered a place where someone has been hiding in plain sight, where the walls have opened in ways they were never meant to, it becomes difficult to trust that any wall is truly solid, or that you are ever entirely alone. It was in the fall of 2020, during a business trip that, in retrospect, should have been as routine and forgettable as the dozens I had taken before it, that something happened which I still cannot entirely explain, though I have spent many nights quietly reliving it. I had flown into Cincinnati to attend a 3-day conference for software professionals, the kind of event where the content blends into a blur of panel discussions, overlong PowerPoint presentations, and the indistinct murmur of strangers networking in beige carpeted halls. My accommodations had been arranged by the company. Nothing extravagant, just a reliable chain hotel along the riverfront that catered to traveling professionals who required nothing more than clean sheets, dependable Wi-Fi, and coffee available before sunrise. I remember arriving at the hotel well past 11 o'clock at night. The sky outside a blank curtain of overcast darkness, and the surrounding streets rendered quiet and largely empty by the season and the hour. Inside the hotel lobby, a low hush hung in the air, broken only by the faint tapping of a keyboard at the front desk, where a lone receptionist with tired eyes barely looked up as she processed my check-in. The space around me had the sterile stillness that most business hotels adopt after hours, with dimmed lighting that cast elongated shadows across the tiled floor, and an ambient hum that came from somewhere unseen, possibly from the elevator banks or the concealed ductwork that regulated the air. My assigned room was located on the 7th floor, tucked away at the end of a long hallway that curved subtly to the right, giving the illusion of more space than there likely was. The carpet beneath my shoes was thick and soft, designed to muffle footfalls, and the overhead lights were spaced just far enough apart to leave portions of the corridor in a gentle gloom, which seemed intentional but nonetheless contributed to a vaguely isolating atmosphere. I reached my room without seeing another soul on the floor and entered to find the space exactly as I had expected. Neutral tones, twin beds separated by a nightstand, a desk with a factory-issued office chair, blackout curtains pulled tightly shut over the window, and a soft mechanical buzz coming from the wall-mounted HVAC unit. After brushing my teeth and changing into sleep clothes, I found myself lying awake in bed, staring into the shadows above me as the minutes passed with uncomfortable slowness. Despite my exhaustion, my mind remained alert and wired, likely a result of the artificial energy from too much conference coffee and the overstimulation of prolonged social interaction. I tried distracting myself with the television, scrolling absently through channels I had no intention of watching. The volume kept low enough to avoid disturbing anyone on the other side of the walls. Eventually, I shut it off and closed my eyes, hoping the silence would lull me into sleep, though it did the opposite. Sometime later, after the building had settled into complete stillness, I heard the sound that would mark the beginning of what has remained one of the most unsettling and unresolved experiences of my life. It was a knock, soft, controlled, and slow. 3 evenly spaced raps against the door that separated my room from the hallway. At first, I remained still, unsure whether the noise had truly come from my door or had drifted in from somewhere else. But after a few seconds of silence, I heard it again. The second set of knocks, though only slightly louder than the first, carried with them a peculiar deliberateness, as though whoever stood outside wasn't unsure or timid, but rather was following a fixed routine or set of instructions. Pushing aside the covers, I walked toward the door cautiously, more curious than alarmed, though a faint thread of unease had begun to wind its way through my thoughts. I did not open the door immediately. In fact, I did not open it at all. But instead, I leaned forward and looked through the peephole, expecting perhaps to see a confused guest who had mistaken my room for their own, or perhaps a staff member with the wrong room number. What I saw instead left me completely still and unable to move for several long moments. Standing just beyond the threshold, framed by the dim lighting of the corridor, was a woman I'd never seen before. Someone who did not fit neatly into any explanation that came to mind. She appeared to be in her 30s or early 40s, of average height and thin build, and was barefoot, her pale feet pressed flat against the patterned hallway carpet in a way that struck me as vulnerable and strange. She wore a white bathrobe, unmistakably one of the hotel-issued garments, though it hung loosely from her shoulders, the belt tied without care, and the hem falling just above her ankles. Her dark hair, which fell unevenly to her shoulders, appeared damp, as though she had stepped from a shower and into the hallway without drying it. And there was a heaviness into the way it clung to her neck and collar. What truly unsettled me, though, was not the specifics of her appearance, but the way she was standing, angled slightly away from the door, not directly facing it, with her head tilted downward and to the side, as though she were either unwilling or unable to meet the gaze of anyone looking out. Her arms hung at her sides, fingers slack, and she did not shift her weight or show any of the typical nervousness one might expect from someone caught in an awkward situation. She simply stood there, silent, unmoving, and entirely still, in a way that made the hallway itself seem quieter, as though the air around her had thickened. I watched her for what must have been close to a full minute, unwilling to speak or knock back or even breathe too loudly. It wasn't that I was afraid of her in any traditional sense, but rather that something about her presence felt out of place. Not just in the hotel, but in the world I understood. Her being there seemed like a mistake, not of location, but of reality. At some point, she lifted her head ever so slightly, just enough that the dim lighting caught the curve of her jaw and the pale line of her mouth. She appeared to whisper something then, something brief and quietly spoken, though I could not hear it through the thick wood of the door. I could see the words leave her lips, shaped slowly, as though she were reciting something she had said many times before, or something she had been made to repeat. Though no sound reached me, I would later find the words replaying in my mind with alarming clarity, as though I had absorbed them not through hearing, but through some deeper impression. Without turning to look at me, without glancing toward the door even once, she began to walk away. Her movements were smooth and steady, entirely unhurried, and she moved as if unaware of being observed. Her bare feet made no sound on the carpet, and her figure receded into the darkness of the corridor, eventually vanishing around the corner in complete silence. I stayed at the door for a long time after she vanished from sight, not because I expected her to return, but because I couldn't quite convince myself it had happened at all. There had been something so unnerving about her silence, about the way she moved, the way she never once looked directly at the door, as if I hadn't been there at all. Eventually, I backed away and returned to bed, though sleep was out of reach. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how strange her posture had been, how deliberately she had knocked, and how the words I'd seen pass her lips had carried more weight in their silence than if she had screamed. When morning finally came, the familiar patterns of daylight and routine returned to the hotel. Guests passed in and out of the lobby holding coffee cups and luggage. Televisions hummed with local news in the breakfast area, and housekeeping carts rolled quietly across the hallways. It was as if the building had no memory of what I'd seen, or perhaps it had chosen to forget it. Still unsettled, I went down to the front desk and spoke with the staff. I described the woman exactly as I remembered her. Barefoot, wearing the hotel bathrobe, hair still damp, standing outside my door at 2:15 in the morning. The man behind the desk listened politely but seemed unfazed, like this sort of thing wasn't worth more than a mild curiosity. He assured me that no guest matching that description had been checked into any room on the 7th floor or anywhere in the hotel, and there had been no reports of anyone in distress or acting strangely during the night. When I asked about the hallway surveillance footage, he gave a practiced response. Something about hotel policy, how footage was for internal security only, and could only be reviewed in cases where there was a confirmed incident, which according to their logs, there hadn't been. There was no alarm, no real concern, just a vague professionalism that closed the matter before it had really begun. I left the hotel later that afternoon, with my suitcase rolling behind me and a heavy sense that whatever had happened that night had slipped neatly through the cracks of whatever system was supposed to keep track of unusual things. No one asked for a statement. No one followed up. And if anyone else had seen her, they either hadn't come forward or had been told the same thing I was, that there was nothing to report. I've thought about her often since then. Not obsessively, not in the way one replays a nightmare, but in those quiet moments when the world is still and your thoughts wander somewhere they shouldn't. I still see her standing there in the hallway, her face half-shadowed, her mouth shaping that phrase in a whisper I never heard but somehow understood. They won't let me leave. I don't know who she was, and I doubt I ever will. Maybe it was someone who needed help, someone who slipped through the cracks in a different way, mentally, emotionally, maybe even physically. But the way she stood there, the way she moved, the way no one else seemed to know anything about her, it all stayed with me longer than I ever expected. And sometimes, when I check into a hotel late at night and find myself walking down another quiet hallway with that same recycled air and muted carpet underfoot, I can't help but wonder if she ever got out, or if she was ever supposed to. I hadn't anticipated anything unusual when I arrived in Chicago that week, as it was supposed to be just another standard business trip. 3 days filled with scheduled presentations, polite but forgettable conversations in hotel lobbies, and late evenings spent answering work emails from a sterile room that could have been in any city across the country. The hotel, a tall glass and steel high-rise just off Michigan Avenue, was the kind of place tailored for travelers like me, neutral, efficient, and designed to leave as little impression as possible. When I approached the front desk to check in, the clerk informed me with a rehearsed smile that my reservation had been upgraded to a corner suite on the highest floor, due to a minor system error that had overbooked my original room. I didn't complain, nor did I ask questions, as I simply accepted the key card and rode the elevator all the way to the top, unaware at the time that this small shift in accommodation would mark the beginning of something I still struggled to fully explain. The suite itself was sharp and modern, with carefully chosen decor and muted grays and soft beige tones, and furniture that had clearly been designed to be unobtrusive and universally appealing. What stood out most, however, were the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows that covered one wall entirely, giving way to a narrow balcony framed by tempered glass railings, from which the full sprawl of downtown Chicago revealed itself in twinkling, miniature detail far below. I remember standing there for a moment after setting down my bag, my hands resting lightly on the cool metal of the railing as I leaned forward to look out at the lake, which shimmered in the cold evening light like a dark sheet of brushed steel. And even then, I noticed how eerily quiet it was that high up. The sounds of the city reduced to an inaudible murmur beneath 37 floors of distance and insulated glass. Later that night, after settling in and attending a few perfunctory meetings, I returned to the room, ate a quiet dinner downstairs, and eventually made my way back up to the suite, where I stood for a moment just inside the sliding door to the balcony, observing the silent grid of windows across the other towers and the blinking red beacons of aircraft lights high above the skyline. Eventually, I locked the balcony door, firmly and deliberately, as I always do out of habit, drew the heavy blackout curtains shut with both hands, and climbed into bed, expecting nothing more than an undisturbed night of sleep in a city I had visited too many times to count. It must have been sometime in the early hours of the morning, perhaps between 3 and 4, when I awoke, not with a jolt or the residual fear of a nightmare, but rather with that subtle, creeping sensation that something was different, that the atmosphere in the room had shifted in some intangible but undeniable way. I was lying on my side, facing the inner wall, and although I couldn't yet pinpoint what had changed, there was a growing certainty that something had stirred me from sleep. Not a sound, not a motion, but the kind of awareness that hums just beneath the skin when you're no longer alone in a space you believed to be private. As my senses slowly adjusted to the dim room, lit only by the soft blue glow of the digital clock beneath the television, I became aware of it. Not a sight or a presence exactly, but a sound. A low, rhythmic, and unmistakably human breathing that came not from the hallway or the adjacent rooms, but from somewhere much closer, somewhere within the room itself. It was a soft and deliberate pattern of inhales and exhales, not labored or erratic, but measured, controlled, and far too near for comfort. And the direction of it, unmistakably, was just beyond the curtain, in the space near the glass door that led out onto the balcony. For several long seconds I remained still, frozen in place by the pure weight of dread as I listened to the continued breathing. Slow and steady, each exhale gently fogging what I could now imagine as the interior side of the sliding glass. And though no footsteps followed, no scrape of movement broke the hush, the sudden stop of that breath, abrupt and complete, was somehow even worse than the sound itself, as if whoever had been producing it had realized in that instant that I was awake and listening. Only once the room had fallen completely silent again did I manage to shift from the bed, moving with cautious deliberation across the soft carpet. There, each step silent, my eyes fixed on the heavy curtain that concealed whatever might have been waiting behind it. I paused at the edge, bracing myself, and then, in a single movement, pulled the curtain aside, half expecting some figure to be standing inches from the glass, but there was nothing. The balcony was empty, the glass still latched, and beyond the transparent barrier, the city lights flickered in their usual rhythm, cold and indifferent. Yet, even with no visible presence outside, my eyes were immediately drawn to a patch on the glass that stood out unmistakably. A circular smear of condensation positioned at about the height where a person's face might have been, with two slightly cleared spots near the center that aligned perfectly with where someone's eyes would have been, as though a head had leaned close to the window and stared inward through the glass while exhaling warm breath against it. The most disturbing detail, however, was not that the mark existed at all, but rather that the condensation was on the interior surface of the glass, inside the room where no one else should have been. I stood frozen, staring at the slow fade of that breath-shaped imprint, unable to look away from the outline of where the moisture had begun to evaporate, leaving behind only the faintest suggestion of a nose, the hollow curve of a mouth, and the shape of something that had been impossibly close. I unlocked the balcony door and slid it open, stepping cautiously into the night air with a shiver running up my spine, though the cold no longer seemed to be the primary source of discomfort. I looked upward, searching for any ledge or balcony from which someone might have descended, but above me there was nothing but the angled overhang of the rooftop, and beyond that, the empty sky. There were no higher rooms, no service platforms, and no place from which someone could have feasibly accessed the balcony from above. And as I turned back inside and slid the door shut once more, relatching it carefully, I could feel the thin edge of dread sharpening into something more personal and unshakable. Later that morning, after getting dressed and trying to shake the unease that still clung to me, I went downstairs and asked to speak with hotel security. I explained, as calmly as I could, what I had experienced: the breathing, the condensation, the unmistakable impression that someone had been standing just beyond the curtain in the middle of the night. They took me to a back office and reviewed footage from the hallway cameras outside my room, along with exterior views of the building. But nothing stood out. No one had entered or exited my room. The hallway had been completely quiet, and when they pulled up the angles showing the balcony, the video didn't show anyone climbing, hanging, or even walking near the top floor. When I asked how that was possible, how someone could have been standing just outside my locked door without being seen on any footage, the man behind the desk glanced at his colleague, then gave me a kind of practiced response, the kind you offer when there's no real answer to give. He said something like, "We've had reports of guests climbing between balconies before, which might have sounded plausible had I not been staying on the highest floor of the building, with no balcony above mine, no roof access, and no physical structure from which someone could have descended." The way he said it made me think he wasn't even trying to convince me, just checking off the box of what he was required to say. I didn't demand to be moved or threaten to leave. I just thanked them and returned to my room, trying to tell myself that maybe I'd misinterpreted something, that I'd been overtired, or that the ventilation system had created that sound, or that maybe the condensation had formed naturally and I was simply projecting onto it. I stayed one more night, though I didn't sleep much. I left the lights on. I kept the curtain drawn wide open. I didn't go near the glass after dark. Since then, I've traveled more times than I can count, staying in hotels all over the country. High floors, city views, sleek modern rooms that are all variations of the same corporate comfort. But I don't open balcony doors anymore. I don't pull the curtains closed. And I still check the glass before bed, not because I believe something will be there, but because I remember the one time something might have been. I've tried to be rational about it. I've tried to let it go. But when I think back to that night in Chicago, what stays with me isn't fear in the usual sense. It's the certainty that for one brief moment, someone was standing so close to me that their breath left a mark on the inside of the glass. And even now, lying in some unfamiliar room in a city I've never really seen, I sometimes catch myself listening too closely to the quiet, straining for a sound I hope I'll never hear again. Not because I believe in ghosts, but because I no longer believe the lock is enough.